There's a particular hour in a man's life when the world doesn't collapse dramatically. It simply goes silent. You're still surrounded by movement, still walking through a city lit by thousands of windows, still brushing past people with urgent lives. Yet inside, something has emptied out. It feels less like being abandoned and more like standing in an ancient amphitheater after everyone has gone home. The stone is still warm from the crowd, but the performers, the voices, the reason you were there, gone. And you realize you're not just alone in this moment. You've been alone for much longer than you've admitted. Many men misinterpret that silence. They think the numbness is proof that they're failing at strength, or that they're simply built differently, destined to carry everything without leaning on anyone. One of the earliest illusions we internalize is the belief that if we feel this lonely, it must mean something is wrong with us, not with the conditions we survived. But loneliness often isn't a verdict. It's a mirror held up to a life that never learned how to be held. Picture yourself entering a once familiar home at dawn. The furniture is exactly where it used to be. The hallway still smells like old wood, and the light spills in through blinds that were never replaced. Everything is intact, yet the air is lifeless. Dust floats like slow-moving ghosts, suspended in a space that remembers warmth but can't produce any on its own. That's what loneliness feels like for many men. A home that looks functional on the outside but has lost its ability to answer back. And beneath that silence lives a rule we were never consciously taught but absorbed through watching the men before us. Don't need, don't ask, don't crack. It's a quiet oath, passed down like an inheritance, and it works until it doesn't. Because when betrayal hits, or when the scaffolding of a dysfunctional family system finally collapses, or when the one person you leaned on disappears, that oath becomes a cage. The world doesn't just go silent. It stops responding altogether. As one clinician described it, men often confuse emotional self-abandonment with discipline, only to discover later that it cost them the capacity to receive support when they need it most. There's also a shadow fantasy baked into the story many of us admire: the solitary warrior, the lone samurai, the man who needs no one. It's a powerful myth, but a myth nonetheless. Humans are not designed to live or heal outside the pack. Wolves unravel when they're isolated. Men do too. The mind frays at the edges, the body tightens, and the internal monologue begins to sound less like resilience and more like a bunker you refuse to leave. And yet culturally, the lone wolf identity is still praised as if endurance were the same as emotional health. Loneliness isn't just the absence of people. For many trauma survivors, it's a sensation beneath the ribs, like a hollow pressure, a blueprint that was never finished. I've heard men describe it as a space inside them that should have been shaped by connection, but instead was shaped by vigilance. Not a wound you can point to, but a missing structure you can feel whenever the room quiets. This creates an archetypal conflict. The warrior who believes he must stand alone versus the child who never learned to be held without ridicule. The adult self keeps saying, "I can handle it." The younger self whispers, "I never actually learned how." When those two parts collide, exhaustion is inevitable. And the cost isn't just emotional. Prolonged loneliness rewires the stress-reward circuitry of the brain. Cortisol rises, dopamine weakens. The world begins to look less like a place of potential allies and more like a landscape full of possible threats. Even neutral expressions start to feel loaded. Even simple interactions feel like evaluations you can't afford to fail. What you interpret as disinterest may simply be your nervous system flagging everything as danger because it hasn't felt safe in a long time. So the real question becomes something deeper than, how do I stop being lonely? It becomes, what does rising even mean when trust toward others, toward yourself, toward the future, has been stripped out of your system? What does strength look like when you can't rely on the old version anymore? If any part of this already feels uncomfortably accurate, stay for the middle of this video. There's a pattern men almost never detect. A pattern that quietly locks them into permanent lone wolf mode even when they try to return to connection. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the hour we're entering now. Not the hour the world abandons you, but the hour you begin to understand what that silence is really made of. There comes a moment in every man's inner life when he begins to realize that the thing he called strength was in truth armor, and armor always has a price. At first it protects, later it isolates, and eventually it erases parts of you you didn't intend to sacrifice. Many men carry a quiet pride inside their isolation, a subtle conviction that aloneness is proof of rare insight. You may have felt it yourself, the sense that you walk apart because you see what others can't, because the crowd is blind, because your solitude is a kind of superiority. Yet beneath that pride often lives something much softer and much older. Jung would say that when tenderness is disowned, it doesn't disappear. It resurfaces as disdain for those who express the very needs you learned to suppress. You might dismiss others as too emotional, too needy, too dependent, while privately craving the same nourishment you label as weakness in them. It's not hypocrisy. It's a survival adaptation that grew roots. This creates a projection loop. The part of you that longs for connection gets cast onto the world as something dangerous or unreliable. You protect your self-worth by treating closeness as a threat, not because it truly is, but because being seen feels like stepping into a light that has burned you before. Listen to the tone of your inner voice in moments of withdrawal. When you say, "I prefer being alone," does it feel like an authentic preference or like a shield held a little too tightly against your chest? Often the difference is in the tension beneath the sentence, not the sentence itself. And every shield has a birthplace. Somewhere in your life, dependence carried a cost. Maybe someone mocked you for needing comfort. Maybe support was inconsistent, so relying on anyone felt like gambling with your emotional safety. Maybe vulnerability was punished or simply met with indifference. Over time, the body learns. It builds armor, not out of metal, but out of habits, silence, and self-sufficiency. That armor becomes so familiar that taking it off feels riskier than wearing it. Then the culture steps in and reinforces the narrative. The hero archetype hijacks your biology. Everywhere you look, there is a celebration of the lone samurai, the rogue genius, the man without a master. These figures are admired for their independence, yet independence in myth is not the same as isolation in real life. In real life, mammals regulate in groups. Hormones stabilize through co-regulation. Sleep aligns with predictable rhythms of safety. Impulse control strengthens in environments where you feel held, not hunted. When you grip too tightly to the lone wolf identity, you drift further from the very qualities you associate with strength. What looks like stoicism from the outside can quietly slide into dysregulation on the inside. One reframing moment lands here. Independence that collapses into compulsive scrolling, porn binges, or internal rage is not independence. It's dysregulation wearing a mask. That sentence often stops men because it challenges the story they've told themselves, not with judgment, but with precision. When a man uses isolation to decompress rather than to disappear, he feels more present afterward. But when isolation becomes a pressure chamber, the outcomes are very different. Less focus, more numbness, more intrusive thoughts, more difficulty returning to connection. Over time, self-protection begins deleting pieces of your life. You withdraw from conversations. You ignore messages, telling yourself you'll get to them later, though you rarely do. You assume disinterest before you receive any evidence, and then you resent the silence you helped engineer. Nietzsche once suggested that resentment becomes a philosophy when we are unwilling to face our own powerlessness. In this context, resentment becomes the story you use to explain your loneliness. I don't need them. People always disappoint. No one understands me anyway. These aren't lies. They're shields. And shields are built from experiences that once overwhelmed you. Each avoidance teaches your nervous system that people equal danger and that solitude equals control. It's not a conscious decision. It's conditioning. To understand why the armor feels so necessary, we have to return to the first architects of that conditioning, the adults who taught you, directly or indirectly, that reliance equals humiliation. If anything in this chapter feels uncomfortably accurate, let it breathe. In 2 chapters, we will lay this armor beside real survivor patterns so you can see whether your solitude reflects your temperament or an old wound reenacting itself. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins in rooms where a boy learns, quietly and without language, that his inner world is too heavy, too inconvenient, or too invisible to matter. Before he ever chooses solitude, solitude is chosen for him. And years later, when he finds himself withdrawing from people without understanding why, he is not creating a new pattern. He is reenacting an old one. The first script many men receive is simple: handle it yourself. Not because they're naturally stoic or uninterested in connection, but because their early environment trained their nervous system to link vulnerability with disappointment. Sometimes the caregivers were physically present but emotionally absent. Their faces were there, but their attention wasn't. Feelings were minimized, redirected, or subtly mocked. A clinician once described this as emotional oxygen deprivation, slow enough that you learn to survive it, subtle enough that you don't realize what it cost you. From that, a shadow driver forms. The child absorbs a message he never chose. My feelings are disruptions. Over time, that belief reshapes the way he speaks, relates, and even breathes. He becomes articulate about his thoughts and actions, but freezes when someone asks how he is actually doing. Not because he lacks self-awareness, but because he learned early that expressing need places him at risk. One understated correction from a parent, or one dismissive response from a partner in adulthood, can reopen that old vow of never again letting anyone close enough to hurt him. Then comes the father wound, which is less about blame and more about the body's memory. Fathers who were absent, volatile, or emotionally frozen taught their sons that dependence equals danger. Jung described the father archetype as a figure of blessing and structure. When that archetype is distorted, men grow up searching for its replacement in mentors, leaders, partners, or even rigid self-discipline. They want someone, or something, to confer legitimacy on their life. But the moment that figure fails to meet the fantasy, the man retreats. Not because he expected perfection, but because the collapse feels like confirmation of an older truth. No one is truly safe to rely on. This creates a peculiar paradox. A man who claims to trust no one often longs for one flawless guide, who will finally make him feel grounded. And when that figure inevitably reveals their humanity, the reaction is not mild frustration, but disproportionate collapse. A small failure reactivates an old wound, and the boy inside recoils as if survival itself were threatened. This is not immaturity, it is conditioning. What many men call loneliness today is often a replay of those earlier rooms. Survivor stories echo the same line across cultures and ages. I feel like that lonely kid again when someone doesn't respond. The adult knows it's just a delayed message. The nervous system experiences it as proof of abandonment. That gap, between the adult's logic and the child's fear, is where many relationships begin to erode from the inside. This loop can manifest in two ways. Some men over-pursue, trying to silence the echo by securing closeness. Others shut down entirely, trying to outrun the echo by eliminating the possibility of rejection. Both strategies make sense when seen through the lens of the original injury. They protected the child. But in adulthood, they reinforce the belief that he is either too much or not enough for real connection. Here is a reframing that often lands with precision. The intensity of your loneliness does not reveal a flaw in your character. It reveals the depth of the original injury. When the past has shaped the nervous system, the present can feel harsher than it actually is. Not because reality is unkind, but because the body is still bracing for echoes it hasn't yet learned to distinguish from real threats. And this brings us to a turning point. Loneliness is not just a feeling. With repetition, it becomes an ecosystem inside the brain, a landscape, a climate, something that doesn't simply influence your moods, but frames the way you interpret every social interaction. To understand why rising feels so difficult, we have to look at what happens biologically when loneliness becomes chronic. By the time a man reaches chronic loneliness, something subtle but powerful begins happening inside his biology. The mind doesn't simply feel alone, it starts interpreting the world through the lens of threat. It becomes a split terrain. One part of you longs for connection, hungers for warmth, and aches for conversation that doesn't require armor. And another part tightens the moment someone gets close, bracing for an impact that may not actually be coming. It's not a contradiction. It's the nervous system trying to protect you from a wound it never learned how to recover from. Chronic loneliness activates the body's stress machinery, the HPA axis, like a low-grade alarm that never fully shuts off. Cortisol stays elevated. Muscles hold tension without your permission. Your thoughts begin scanning rooms not for possibility, but for risk. A neutral expression becomes a potential judgment. A quiet pause in a conversation feels like rejection. Nothing dramatic has changed in the world around you. What has changed is the filter through which your brain is reading it. This is one of the cruel ironies of loneliness. It makes you fear the very thing you need in order to heal. Here is a reframing that often loosens something inside men who carry this pattern. Loneliness does not distort you. It distorts perception. When you feel disconnected for long enough, the nervous system loses its ability to accurately interpret social cues. You start hearing threats in ordinary silence. You start expecting withdrawal even when someone is still right there with you. The world doesn't become harsher. Your sensitivity sharpens beyond what the moment is actually asking for. Oxytocin, the hormone we associate with bonding, participates in this distortion. Research shows that in lonely individuals, oxytocin doesn't only increase bonding to safety, it increases attention to exclusion. In other words, when you are isolated, the very chemical designed to support connection can amplify your awareness of danger. You start noticing the smallest shift in tone, the faintest hesitation, the mildest inconsistency. What you call intuition may, in these moments, be a nervous system rehearsing old abandonments rather than reading present reality. This creates the split brain, one hemisphere holding longing, the other holding fear. One wants to step forward, the other pulls you back. And when a man lives in that tension long enough, he often reaches for substitutes, dopamine stand-ins that create tiny bursts of relief without requiring connection. Pornography, endless scrolling, compulsive work cycles, gaming, hustle loops. These aren't moral failings. They're survival improvisations. Attempts to soothe a system that has forgotten how to regulate through other people. Relief does come, but it is brief. After the spike comes depletion. After the distraction comes shame. After the numbing comes the heavier silence. And re-entering real connection becomes harder because the body feels even more unprepared for it. This is the circular trap many men find themselves in. Isolation drives the coping mechanism. The coping mechanism deepens the isolation. Here is another reframing moment that tends to stop a viewer for a breath. What you interpret as lack of discipline may actually be a lack of regulation. When the nervous system is dysregulated, willpower becomes a brittle tool. The body overrides the story you tell yourself about what should be possible. Understanding this removes the moral weight and brings clarity. The struggle is not a failure of character. It is a signal from a system that has been overwhelmed for too long. Amid all of this, something small can begin to shift. The nervous system does not require dramatic breakthroughs. It responds to micro-exposures. If you want to test this, there is an optional experiment described in this chapter. One honest message to one tolerably safe person each day. No confession, no performance, just a simple thread of contact. The purpose is not to build intimacy, but to retrain anticipation, to show the body that vulnerability can coexist with survivable tension. This 1-degree exposure works because it pairs the discomfort of reaching out with the reality of safety. Over time, the brain learns that not every opening leads to injury, that the present is not identical to the past. That connection is not a battlefield waiting to collapse. Yet even with these small shifts, something puzzling often happens. Many men still drift back toward attachments that replicate their loneliness. They step away from safety and return to emotional terrain that feels familiar, even if it hurts. That pattern has its own logic and its own history, which we will explore in the next chapter. There is a particular ache that appears after a painful bond ends. It's not just the loss of the person, it's the collapse of the emotional world that once formed around them. Men often describe it in ways that echo across cultures and forums. Breaking the bond felt like breaking their own heart, or losing the only mirror that ever reflected them clearly, even when that mirror distorted them. This is the paradox of trauma bonds. They shape identity through pain, and when they shatter, the emptiness feels annihilating. What keeps many men circling these bonds is not weakness, it is familiarity. The nervous system attaches not to goodness, but to predictability. If chaos was the background music of childhood, then emotional turmoil in adulthood feels strangely alive. When something or someone once hurt you in a consistent pattern, that pattern becomes a map. and the map feels safer than unfamiliar ground. After separation, men often return not because they desire the suffering, but because the void that follows feels even more threatening. Pain with structure can feel more tolerable than emptiness without orientation. This leads to a difficult truth. The wound isn't the solitude itself. It's the terror of losing the figure who shaped your emotional world, even if that world was a form of captivity. The shadow driver here is ancient. The psyche remembers how it fused identity with survival. The child learned, consciously or not, that attention wrapped in volatility was still attention, and that inconsistency was still connection. When adulthood repeats this dynamic, it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like destiny. Repetition compulsion deepens this cycle. The absence you felt in childhood echoes through your attractions in adulthood. Not because you seek suffering, but because the familiar absence feels like home. Stable affection can feel suspicious. Kindness can feel unearned. Predictability can feel dull because it doesn't activate the survival systems you grew up relying on. Meanwhile, the unpredictable person awakens a sense of aliveness. It's not romance. It's the body recognizing a pattern that once kept you alert enough to survive. This creates a striking polarity. Men often report numbness around people who treat them well, and adrenaline around those who withdraw or destabilize them. The body leans toward the person who resembles the earliest injuries, not because it loves the pain, but because it knows how to navigate that terrain. It is a map carved into the nervous system long before adulthood taught language to describe it. Then something else occurs. After cutting contact with a dysfunctional bond, many men experience a second collapse. The first collapse is emotional. The second is social. Only then do they realize that their entire relational orbit had narrowed around one person, often without their awareness. And when that orbit disappears, a vacuum opens. Evenings feel empty. Weekends stretch long, and the silence becomes thick enough to unsettle the body. It is in this vacuum that a subtle belief emerges. If I were worthy, they would have stayed. This belief doesn't announce itself. It hums underneath behaviors. It shows up in the way you hesitate before trusting new people, in the way you shrink your needs to avoid overwhelming others, in the way you assume rejection before offering anything real. It becomes a quiet script that governs your choices, while convincing you that those choices are simply personality. Here is a reframing that often softens the internal blame. The collapse after no contact is not evidence of inadequacy, it is evidence of starvation. If you build your world around one person, especially one who cannot truly hold you, losing them feels like losing oxygen. The body isn't craving the person, it's craving regulation. And because the bond was chaotic, the regulation was inconsistent. Yet even inconsistent regulation can feel better than emptiness. Rising from this place does not begin with a new partner or a new attachment. It begins with a different internal agreement. Before rebuilding connection, the man must understand why his loneliness gravitates toward the very people who can't hold it. Only then can the pattern loosen enough to allow a different kind of relationship, one built not on reenactment, but on presence. The next chapter begins the shift from haunted attachments to the first quiet pact a man makes with himself, an agreement that does not rely on heroics, performance, or witnesses. At a certain point in a man's healing, a subtle but profound shift appears. He begins to sense that rising does not always happen with applause, breakthroughs, or dramatic reinventions. It often begins in the quiet moments when no one is watching, not the triumphant moments, but the ordinary ones. The moments when you stop performing for an imagined audience and start paying attention to what actually strengthens you. When men first re-enter social spaces after long periods of withdrawal, many compensate without realizing it. They show up with charm, intensity, usefulness, or humor. They become the interesting man, the reliable man, the steady man, anything that ensures they are welcomed without being truly seen. But after these interactions, many report a strange hollowness. They feel unseen not because others failed to notice them, but because what was noticed was the performance, not the person beneath it. This creates a subtle grief. A man begins to realize that he has been shaping himself around other people's comfort for so long that he no longer knows how to present the unedited version of himself. The shadow dynamic here is not deception, but fear. The fear that the ordinary self, the one without polish or strategy, isn't worth knowing. Jung might say that the persona, the social mask, has become too rigid, leaving the real man starving behind it. Here is a reframing that often lands clearly. The first step toward being seen is allowing yourself to be unimpressive. Not inadequate, not diminished, simply human. When interactions no longer require performance, the nervous system can rest. And when the nervous system rests, presence replaces vigilance. This is the soil where genuine belonging begins. Self-mastery enters here, but not in the grandiose sense that culture often glorifies. It is less about power and more about governance, less about conquering the world and more about stewarding your inner terrain with integrity. A man who governs himself doesn't demand perfection from his emotions. He pays attention to what he respects in himself today, not what he hopes others will praise tomorrow. Integrity becomes a compass, not a performance. This is where the work of thinkers like Machiavelli and Jung intersect. Without internal structure, power becomes cruelty, either inward or outward. With internal structure, even small actions feel aligned. You begin asking quieter questions. What version of myself earns my respect today? What choice supports the man I'm becoming rather than the mask I've been maintaining? The answers to these questions don't require applause. They require awareness. As this internal governance strengthens, something small but meaningful changes in how men relate to others. They stop searching for large groups that validate them and begin noticing the value of micro-tribes. 2 or 3 people who know the unedited version of them. Not because these individuals provide certainty, but because they offer continuity, presence, a sense that connection can exist without performance or collapse. Men's groups, survivor communities, and tightly bonded friendships often reveal the same truth. Transformation doesn't begin with a crowd. It begins with a small circle of honest witnesses, not idealized figures, not saviors, not replacements for old wounds, just people who can hold space without demanding a persona in return. And something liberating happens when these small connections take root. Rising stops being a future milestone and becomes a lived posture. Not the absence of loneliness, but the ability to move with it without collapsing, to navigate life with a sense of internal scaffolding rather than relying on adrenaline or avoidance to keep everything standing. At this stage, a man is not fully healed, and he does not need to be. He is simply aligned, present, capable of recognizing where his emptiness comes from without letting it dictate his next step. And as this alignment deepens, another truth emerges. Loneliness may still walk beside him, but it no longer decides his path. The final chapter brings this arc to its closing threshold, the moment when rising becomes less about escape and more about reconstruction. There is a moment, usually quiet and unspectacular, when a man begins to understand that rising does not mean eliminating loneliness. It means learning to move with it, to listen to it, to let it inform him without allowing it to rule him. In that sense, rising resembles rebuilding a temple from its shattered stones. The fire that once destroyed it is still warm on your hands. The pieces are heavy, but each one you lift becomes part of a structure that stands not because it is perfect, but because it is chosen. You are not a man without people. You are a man shaped by history, your own, your family's, and the culture that taught you strength without ever teaching you safety. You are shaped by physiology that reacted the way any mammalian system would react under isolation. And you are shaped by a story of masculinity that praised the hardened exterior while ignoring the cost the interior silently paid. Rising begins when you acknowledge this without shame, when you see that your patterns were not random failures, but coherent responses to the conditions you survived. The armor, the silence, the bonds that hurt, the numbing that followed. None of these were signs of brokenness. They were blueprints drafted under duress, survival strategies written by parts of you that had to act quickly, instinctively, and without guidance. And the remarkable thing about blueprints is that they can be revised, not demolished, not condemned, revised. You can keep the parts that protected you and slowly retire the parts that began to confine you. Here is a reframing that often settles quietly into a man's chest. The true rise is not the dramatic return to confidence or the heroic reclamation of purpose. It is the decision to show up, plain, flawed, unmasked, for small, steady interactions. To let connection grow in increments rather than performances. To choose presence over spectacle. Rising is not a transformation others applaud. It is a shift you feel in how you inhabit your own body. And when you stop mistaking isolation for strength, something else becomes possible. Loneliness turns from a verdict into information. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is this sensation trying to show me?" Instead of fearing the silence, you begin reading it as direction, a compass pointing toward the parts of you that still want to be met, understood, and held, not by fantasy, but by reality. If something in this journey reflected you, even faintly, offering a single line about what resonated can become more than expression. It becomes a signal, a quiet marker that helps another man recognize his own inner landscape. One signal is enough. One sentence. One moment of recognition. With that, the threshold is crossed. Loneliness may still walk beside you, but now it has meaning. Now it has direction. And now, so do you.